Hello everybody, and welcome to this next video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for nearly 11 years now. I work within the directorate that deals with standards, regulation, thought leadership, and my role is to look at the impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. With 130,000 members working in land, property, residential, infrastructure, all the various flavors of commercial real estate right across the property life cycle, the impact of data and technology is profound, both in terms of the opportunities and managing the risks. And today I'm really glad to have Stuart Young of Etive Technologies join us. So please do join me, Stuart.
Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning. And it's always a bit of a question I like to ask before we get into the bits and bytes and the technology, but it's always keen to hear on the kind of background and the origin story of our tech partners, and indeed your personal experience and how you've ended up in the sort of data and technology property space.
Well, we've been working as a prop tech company since 2007, looking at property logbooks and property data. And then from 2014, we started working with identity and working with the government on identity and linking the identity of a person to a property. And this was in the public sector. And that's evolved now to us working on the digital identity trust scheme, which we're now going to be talking about today, this link to the home buying and selling process.
Indeed, indeed. Well, as you know, I'm a part of the home buying and selling group in terms of their data subgroup. So it's a really interesting topic around the whole issue of digital conveyancing. So do tell me, what is this My Identity scheme and what are the objectives behind it, Stuart?
Okay, so for quite a few years now, the government through the DCMS have been working on a digital identity and attributes trust framework. So they've, in very simple terms, they've taken responsibility for identity for UK PLC. But what they've done, which I think they've done very well, is structured underneath that to enable each sector to develop a scheme aligned to the government standards. And it's all around the standards. So we were very fortunate. We got some public funding to develop a scheme specifically for the home buying and selling sector and the home buying and selling process. And this is to support a consumer, someone who's going through the home buying and selling process, to get their identity done once and once only, and in line with DCMS requirements to enable that customer to own their identity and then have the ability to share that through the transaction process. Because we know, as part of work that DLUCH have been doing about improving the home buying and selling process, identity verification for consumers is a high friction area. It is very cumbersome for consumers. It's also actually quite cumbersome for conveyancers and estate agents and brokers and lenders, because the big problem is that everyone is working to different standards. So the big thing to point out is the inconsistency in standards. So no one can trust and reuse the identity carried out by a third party. So everyone has to do it again. So as you can imagine, for the consumer, as we know, we had market research done for us last year by Hunter's Estate Agency. And one of the things that came out of that very highly was the friction from consumers. Why am I consistently having to do this time and time again when I've proved my identity once? And certainly feedback from the sector is that they find it cumbersome and they get that complaint from their client, and it slows down the onboarding process. It contributes towards delays in the process. And combined with all this, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that COVID over the last 2 years has accelerated the need for digital identity verification as people were unable to meet face to face. And work that's been going on around there has certainly accelerated the requirement. And finally, we've got to also remember, surprisingly, that property and mortgage fraud has increased and continues to increase. So even from an operational point of view, there's a requirement to increase the barriers to fraud and provide greater protection for consumers and all those service providers, conveyancers, brokers, lenders in the marketplace.
So I mean, you mentioned obviously DLUCH as being one of the government stakeholders, and obviously at that high level, you know, the DCMS is setting standards and policy objectives. So how is the My Identity scheme fitting in with those technical government standards and also those kind of policy objectives, both from that kind of home buying perspective that DLUCH look at, and obviously from that higher data sort of strategy that DCMS are involved in?
Yeah, so in order to develop the scheme, which is now called My Identity, because I think a digital identity trust scheme for the home buying and selling process is a bit of a mouthful. So we've looked at something that's quite consumer friendly, so hence we've called it My Identity. So over the last year and a half, we've worked with about 120 organizations, and that included 5 government departments, regulators, representative bodies, and then those that are operating on the coalface, and of course the identity providers. And over through that, what we were able to do is look at the requirements of what the DCMS guidelines were doing. So in there, they have a thing called GPG 45, which is the Good Practice Guides 45. And that is about how to do identity verification. And this is very important because from the identity providers, they're all doing it in slightly different ways. And for the consumers of those identities, so the estate agents, the conveyancers, the brokers, lenders, they all have different requirements. So the GPG 45, the scheme stands about introducing a consistent standard for everyone to work to. So, and what that actually does, if you look at the standards, it actually pulls the standards up the way of how people do ID&V. It's not about working to the lowest common denominator. So what we've been doing is then what we did through the various working groups was understand the requirements of what does an estate agent need out the process, what does a conveyancer need out of it, and what does the financial services sector. And then very importantly, we looked at what do the regulators, the SRA, the CLC, the UK Finance, what do they require out of it? And then trying to align all this. And you can imagine some of the challenges we had. Even if you take the legal sector, for example, you've got SRA regulated lawyers and CLC regulated conveyancers, and there was misalignment there. So there's been a lot of work being done to align the industry so that we as an industry, as a sector, get a scheme that meets our requirements. But very importantly, that what we've done is make sure they're aligned to the DCMS framework. And we've seen that DCMS have already started to legislate on this with right to rent and right to work from the 6th of April of this year. And something I'm sure we'll talk about but later on is some of the impacts it will have, especially on the identity providers. But I think for the industry, what it is now doing is instilling a greater understanding and trust in a set of standards that we can all trust and use, so that when a consumer gets their identity done, when I share it with you as my conveyancer or my broker, you can look at it and go, this has been done to a recognized industry standard. So the other thing that we've had to do through the development of the scheme is alignment with the AML, anti-money laundering regulation. And the big change there, which I don't think everyone's that aware of, but they were updated in October 2019. And in those regs, it is quite clear that you can trust and use the IDV carried out by a third party, so long as that third party is certified to a set of government and industry standards. And this is the work that DCMS are really doing. And this is very important for the scheme, is working with some identity providers who are working towards that certification. And that is really important. And then what that really means, it helps you as an industry, it helps the conveyancers, the brokers to actually accept my identity that's been done by someone else, not have to redo it again, and then have the ability to share that through the process.
So I mean, how have these various market participants responded? Because as you know, I well know that there's a number of players in the conveyancing market. Just looking at that, and not even thinking about the private rented sector, for example, how have they responded in terms of uptake and appetite and understanding of this?
Okay. In no order of importance, but in fact, I'll work from reverse, from the lenders. We've had enormously great support from the financial services sector, from the likes of UK Finance and BSA, because the Building Societies Association, because they understand very clearly the issue of identity, because it's their money that they're giving out, So we have a variety of working groups there. Now, we've always known that getting the financial services sector to change the way that they're operating would be slow and quite a methodical process. So we've been doing a lot of work with their support, with their members, and looking at how they, as a sector, can start to change their process and procedures to accept that identity that's presented to them. So that's a long work in progress. Moving back from that are the brokers. So the brokers kind of obviously it's the second most highest entry point for consumers. The brokers is more of a challenge because obviously they're stuck in the middle between arguably the conveyancers and what the lenders want, but they understand it, and there's been a lot of work and support being done through some of the mortgage lending clubs. So for example, Legal and General Mortgage Club have done a lot of work to help us in advising and then supporting through. And then on the legal side, we've had enormous support because, again, the legal sector really understand the problem because more often than not, they carry the liability if something goes wrong. I think the challenge for the legal sector, and particularly the conveyancers and the lawyers, is can they adopt these digital identity standards for doing identity verification? But they need the confidence they're not in breach of their regulation.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work being done with the likes of the CLC. SRA had a lot of contribution, CLC to us, helping us. So we were trying to align that. And this is where there's a big education piece required, especially for the conveyancing sector, that the AML regs actually, and their standards allow them to share that identity. It is actually in place, and it's just work that's going on there. So very fortunately, we've got the Law Society doing some work with BSA and UK Finance, looking at the Lender's Handbook, for example. Now, that's not going to change right away, but it'll take time for it to change. But the key thing is how everyone is working together to improve and introduce these standards, and how we're sitting in the middle to try and align everyone together. And finally, I think in fairness, the biggest challenge we've got are the estate agents. They don't carry any liability in this, and they are arguably the main entry point for consumers when they come into it. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done there with the estate agency sector on this. In the whole, they understand what's happening, but it's how they adopt it and embrace.
Indeed. Now, you mentioned earlier that obviously, sadly, that there's still a level of fraud in this process. And sometimes people, I think, see digitization as only making that worse. And arguably, I would argue that there's an opportunity here to make it better. So how do you see this scheme addressing the level of fraud we see at the moment?
Yeah. So because if we look at the current processes of ID&V, every time I engage with one of the stakeholders in the process, I have to go through another ID&V. And with everyone working to different standards, there's always a weak point in there. And, fraudsters, spending 3 months sitting on their laptop at home in their armchair can make £200,000-400,000. The business case is very good for them. There's an easy business case. So what this is trying to do is to introduce greater surety and standards around that. So, at the heart of AML processes is the need to prove the identity of that person. We know that 60% of fraud starts with identity. So we need to increase that bar. So by introducing the GPG 45 standards and the AML requirements, as I said earlier, what that does, it increases the barriers to identity verification, because the processes they have to go through now are consistent. What that does for the identity providers as well is they have to work through to become certified. So they have to now be able to evidence to the industry the standards that they are working to, because at the moment they're theoretically or technically working to their own standards. So what this can do is for the industry say, I can trust and use that identity because now it's very clear what standards that company is working towards. The other big shift in this is that identity providers are now going to be carrying liability. At the moment, they've never carried liability, and those that are working to the scheme. So if they don't do what they're meant to do, they're now carrying, as part of the scheme, up to £1 million of liability. So hopefully that will help focus everyone's mind on this as well. We know that, for example, digital identity verification, digital methods of identity verification are far more secure and trusted and reliable. We've seen this with work that Land Registry have embraced through their safe harbor method of identity verification and the assurances that they're giving behind that as well. And if you wanted to try and look at this internationally and saying, okay, where can we draw examples from? We've seen in the Scandic countries, for example, where in Norway, when they introduced their one digital ID system, fraud transactions went down from 1% of all financial transactions to 0.00042%. So I think that alone should give everyone some comfort about what's happening. And last year there's that famous, or infamous, should I say, property fraud of the vicar, I think, who lost his property in Luton.
Yeah, the Luton one.
Yeah. And what happened there was someone shared their ID, and the person reviewed that ID and just said, "Oh, I trust the person because I've met the person." Conveyancers, estate agents, brokers, with all due respect, they're not trained on document fraud and identity fraud. They have understanding and knowledge of it. Digital identity methods are now, especially the technologies being used by the industry, they're vastly improved. And again, as I said earlier, COVID accelerated this.